Hey guys, this is Ben with Tilmor, and today I'm going to show you guys how to access and remove and replace the seal on the 2-speed. Before we get started with that, go ahead, secure your tractor, make sure your battery disconnect switch is in the off position, your e-brake is set. Make sure you're on a nice flat surface, get your tractor jacked up, put it on jack stands, and start off, you're going to want to remove your wheel. Check out the other videos on how to do that. You're going to want to remove your fender, your rotor cover, your final drive assembly, your axle, and your rotor, all to gain access to the seal. Let's go ahead and let's get started. First though, we're going to remove our rotor cover. It gives you a little more light, allows you to be able to see what you're doing just a little bit better. To remove that, you're going to need a 3/8 socket. It's just 4 bolts. Take that, lay it off to the side. Next, we're going to remove 3 bolts here to remove the cover to be able to access the snap ring. You have to remove the snap ring to be able to slide the final drive out. This cover is siliconed on, so you're going to have to break it free. It may be really stuck or it might pop right off. So that's what you're going to have to do. You're going to need a pair of snap ring pliers. Always make sure you have your safety glasses on, anything you're doing. Don't get stuff in your eyes, but these snap rings can be a little bit tricky. They can go flying off. Remove your snap ring. Once you've got your snap ring removed, now you're ready to go ahead and remove the bolts and be able to slide the final drive off. We definitely recommend lifting it from one of the 2 holes. So on the other side, you'll lift it from this hole. On this side, you'll obviously lift it from the top hole. You want to be able to pick it up from the top side because it's unbalanced, it's heavy. If you try to use a jack, it may roll off, so just be very careful if you're doing it that way. But we definitely recommend picking it up from the top. So we're going to go ahead and use our chain hoist here. I go ahead and I put a little bit of tension on it because when you do remove all the bolts, the final drive has a tendency to want to fall down. So if there's no tension on it, the final drive can swing clear around. So that's why I attach the hoist and pull tension up on it to hold it in place before I remove the bolts. You'll need a 15/16 socket and a wrench. And after you've got all 3 bolts out, you'll go ahead and you'll just work it and slide it out. This may slide off really easy, it may not. You might have to wiggle it and move it around because you are sliding the axle through the splined gear up there. So it may come off easy, it may not. But go ahead and just kind of work it out, slide it off, and there you go. There you have your final drive is removed. Once you've gotten to this point, let's go ahead and we're going to remove our fender, all to gain access so we can see a little bit better. So there's 2 bolts up here. There's 2 bolts back here. Before you take the top 2 bolts out, if you look in here, there's 2 1/4-inch bolts here, and there's also a 1/4-inch bolt up here. So swing around in here. These 2 lower bolts hold on the battery cover. And then there's one more kind of tucked up under here. All right, now you're ready to come back under here and take out these 2 bolts. But obviously before you take those 2 bolts out, support the fender because it will fall down. Alrighty, once we got the fender out of the way, obviously you can see why we take that out. You can definitely see a lot better. We're gonna want to go ahead and remove the bushing from the center of the brake rotor so that you can get the axle and the brake rotor out. Before you do that though, you're gonna want to drain the oil out of the 2-speed. There's a video on how to do that. Refer back to that video, but if you don't drain the oil, you are going to have a big mess when you pull that axle out. So to remove that bushing and the axle and the brake rotor, what you're going to want to do is remove these 3 bolts. The bushing is designed that when you remove those bolts, you need to thread those bolts back into it to separate the bushing from the brake rotor. It frees everything up and allows it to slide apart. The threads are the same as the bolts you remove. Some scenarios you may need a longer bolt. So for this, we're going to just go ahead and grab our longer bolts, but the threads in there are the exact same as the bolts you pull out. So it's kind of different. You're removing 3 bolts, but you're only threading 2 back in. So once you get those started, you can go ahead and run them in with either an impact or use a ratchet. But they need to be threaded in evenly. You can't just thread one clear in and not thread the other one in because it's going to bind it. You're probably going to break the bolt off and then you have a bigger mess. So go ahead and thread them in evenly. And as you see there, we threaded that one in and it popped it apart. So once it pops apart, you're going to be able to just slide it out just like that. So here's your axle, there's half of your bushing. Take note though that there's 2 keyways. There's a keyway here on the outside of that one that actually slides in to the rotor right there. And then there's a keyway that's actually on the axle. So when you go to reinstall, make sure you have those 2 keyways. So I kind of like to leave them all attached like that so it kind of keeps everything together. You're going to want to remove these bolts back out of the bushing. All right, go ahead and lay that off to the side. Then basically your rotor just slides up out of there. One nice thing though for reinstallation, you're going to want to take that rotor, you're going to want to kind of pry on it and push on it. Prying is probably going to be the most successful. You want to open that caliper back up so when you go to put it back together, you don't have to fight it to get it back in the pads. Go ahead and lay your rotor off to the side. We're getting closer. Once we've got to this spot, we still need to remove a couple more things to gain access to our seal in there. First, what you're going to want to do though is you're going to want to unplug your speed sensor wire, and we're going to need to cut the zip tie to be able to get that completely out of the way. So I always like to tuck the wires kind of out of the way, make it so you can still see it so you don't forget to plug it back in, but so it doesn't get damaged. We're going to want to remove these 2 1/4-inch bolts here. You can remove these, or you can bring a wrench in here to try to get that bolt out, but I found that it was easiest just to remove it. There is a bolt, a washer, and a nut on those. That just holds the bracket, that holds your speed sensor. Now that we have that removed, now we can actually see all the bolts that we need to remove. So these 3 bolts are going to get removed completely. This bolt up here is just going to get loosened. And I can show you why we need to loosen that here in a little bit. If you look on here, you're going to see multiple bolts that have blue stripes on them. Those bolts all have Loctite put on them when we install them here at the factory. So let's go ahead and let's remove our bolts. This one's going to have a couple things attached to it. It has the piece that keeps your emergency brake pad right here in the right position. There's also 2 big washers under that you're going to need to remove. So the top one here, we're literally just loosening it so it allows us to be able to reinstall those washers easily. And then after you get those loosened and removed, let's go down here and let's remove our 3rd bolt. And that is going to look like that. So, and that, now we've gained access to our seal on our 2-speed. You're going to need some, not necessarily special tools, but when you're removing the seal, you're going to need angled crowbars or pry bars. I'm going to show you another way to be able to do it with screws. The main thing is do your best to not damage the housing, because if you put a large gouge in the housing, it's probably going to leak again. So make sure you do your best to not damage the housing, and if you do, you're going to need to repair it, clean it up, make it so you have that sealed up properly. So now we've got to this point, we're going to go over here to the bench, and I'm going to show you how to remove and reinstall that seal over here on the bench, so you guys can see it a little bit better. Now that we're over here at our bench, you guys can see a little bit better. This is what our 2-speed looks like. Don't remove the 2-speed from the tractor just to do this seal. We just have it out here on the bench so you guys can see. Basically, I'm going to give you a couple different ways to be able to get this seal out. The seal, it is obviously failed, so you don't have to get it out. If it takes, you have to get it out in 2 pieces, okay, just get the seal out without damaging the 2-speed. That's all we need to do. Before we do that though, kind of take note of how deep the seal is set into the 2-speed. You can take a dial caliper and measure it, and we can flash the number up of how deep these seals are installed. That way you guys kind of have a reference point. It's not super exact that it has to be that exact depth, but it needs to be in there straight, and we want to get it close to the depth that these here are. So you can use angled pry bars, adjustable pry bars. You can use a cat's claw for nail pulling. We got other pry bars here. You can go to your local hardware store and get an actual seal puller. They're not real expensive. You may be able to use it for other projects, but one way that I was taught to remove seals, if you can't gain access to them real well, is to actually run screws in them and use a pair of pliers to pull it out, or you can use your cat claw to pull it out like that. But when you're doing that, I always pre-drill a hole into the seal. Just be careful you don't drill in too deep. You don't want to hit the bearing on the inside. So once you get that pre-drilled holes in there, I always wipe my shavings off, try to keep it as clean as possible. These are just normal drywall screws. You can use sheet metal screws, you can use a self-tapping screw, whatever you have laying around. Drill a small hole in the seal, so hopefully when you run these in that they don't pull through the seal before you've got the seal removed. So just start them. Once again, don't run them in too far because you don't want to damage anything on the inside. So basically, I always try to grab them and just kind of work them out. And sometimes they pop right out, sometimes they don't. And so that's what will happen, is the screw will just pull out. So it's not, obviously not a big deal. You'll just have to put more holes in the seal. And once you get the seal moving, then it comes out easy, but you have to break it free of the 2-speed. So neither of those broke it free, so we'll just go ahead and we will drill 2 more holes in it. We can go ahead and try our cat's claw, see if that'll pull it. We can put it down here. And there we've successfully removed that seal. Like I said, it may come out with the first screw that you put in there and you use, or it may take 4 of them like it did here. So when you're doing it, if the first 2 screws fail, don't be like, well, I got to try something else. You can keep trying it, and eventually you'll weaken that seal enough that you'll be able to pop it out of there. So once you have the seal out, we want to start to clean up the area. So just wipe it out with a rag. You can spray a little cleaner on there. And then after you get it wiped out, I always take a real fine grit sandpaper and just clean it up. You basically want to knock that edge of sealer off so the new seal slides in. So once you get it cleaned up, get it smoothed out, wipe it down again, you're ready to install your new seal. So obviously if you look at the seal, there's an open side and then a closed side. The closed side goes out. It'll go in there just like that. I've been showed how to put seals in. You can put, like they call it, a number 2 sealant on the outside. You can get that at a local hardware store, and we can flash that up on the screen so you guys know what to grab. You can put that on. You can put Loctite on and smear Loctite clear around it, or some guys just put them in just dry, just like that. So doesn't matter. It's whatever you prefer. The sealer that you put around it tends to take up some of the imperfections in the casting and gives you a little bit higher success rate on the seal not leaking. So to put the seal in, go ahead and get it started. then I just use a flat piece of wood. And obviously in the tractor it's going to be a little bit more difficult, but you can use the piece of wood like that, you can use the piece of wood like that, however you got to do to get it in there, but you just want to make sure you get it in there straight. Don't put one side way in before you start the other side, or you're liable to crinkle the seal. We have a tool here to help install them. You may have to get creative. Once you get the seal to this point, you can put a socket around there and tap it in to the correct depth, or you can use a punch, but be careful. If you use a punch, you might knock a hole in it or dent it. You do not want to do that. So let's go ahead, let's install it the rest of the way. So they don't go in real hard once you get them straight. So that is removing and reinstalling the seals on your 2-speed on your tractor. Both lower seals are the same. We're just showing you how to do the right side, but the left side is the exact same thing. So it just has a longer axle. So now we're ready to reinstall it and put everything back together on the tractor. Now that you've got your seal replaced, now you're ready to reassemble everything. Like I said, the bolts that have blue lines on them get blue Loctite when they get put back together. So you're going to want this small plate here. Always wipe it off. Make sure there's no dirt and debris on it, no oil. So it's not, the holes are not all, it's not symmetrical, like they're different. So they definitely go in a specific spot. So it's going to go just like this, and it's going to sit in there just like that. So the hole that's kind of over here by itself goes on the bracket for the brake mechanism, the emergency brake mechanism. So let's go ahead and we'll put that one on first. There's kind of a lot of pieces, you got to stack them all together, but put a little Loctite on it. I guess an easy way you could do it is you could just temporarily start these two small bolts in here. That'll hold that flat black circle. It'll hold it in place. You're going to have to remove those, but so take your two thick washers, and they lay right against that black circle that I just showed you, and they slide up behind that black bracket there, and that is how that piece is supposed to, the bolt slides through this, then through the black bracket, and then through the two large washers. Get it all lined back up. Since you have these two bolts started, you can go ahead and tighten this one. But that L-shaped piece, you basically set it so when your emergency brake drum goes around, that it holds the emergency brake so it doesn't rub as it's going down the road or going through the field. So, and that piece is slotted, it's adjustable, so there, as you can hear it rub, you'll just drop that piece down. It allows that emergency brake to drop down, and you will find that it does like to spin back and or flop back and forth. If you just grab a screwdriver and kind of hold it in the right spot, because when you go to tighten the bolt, it wants to flop forward. But like that. And it needs to be up just a little bit higher. And that's what you want. You want the brake drum to be able to spin clear around and not rub. So once you have that one tight, go ahead and tighten the top one. We'll pull the small bolts back out, put some Loctite on them. Then we need to take this bracket you want to go ahead and pre-start all your bolts. That way you don't cross-thread them with the impact. Tighten those, and then you're going to grab the bracket that holds the speed sensor. And this has to be set in the proper position as well, or your miles per hour will not read correctly. Or you'll be driving along and it'll be reading, and then it'll all of a sudden go to 0 if this is not set correctly. The reason we know that is because we've set them wrong at the factory and we have to go back in and adjust them. So let's go ahead and let's put both bolts and washers down through. Hold it with the other hand to start the nut. So here you have the tone ring, and here's the sensor. You want that sensor to be reading in the center of those gaps, because if you get it to where it's reading too much up here, it's not going to work correctly, or if it's too low, it's not going to pick up the signal. So you want it close, and you want it reading in the center of those openings. The way to set that is this drum moves in and out. We pull it out, then I always take it and I pull it just a little bit farther, because if you leave it laying against that tone ring, it will rub and it'll make a sound and you think there's something wrong with your tractor, and it's just this sensor rubbing on that tone ring. So I pull the drum out and then I lay the sensor back just ever so slightly so it doesn't rub. Once you get the sensor set in the right spot and at the right depth, you'll go ahead and you'll tighten these 2 1/4-inch bolts. So I like to pull it clear out. Just snug it up so you can still move it. Pull it out. Actually, the best way to do it is to push it in, and then when you pull the drum out, it takes and it lays that sensor back a little bit. And then I just move it just ever so slightly. And if you hold the nut and twist on the bolt, it should keep it in the right spot. It doesn't move it around. So basically you just spin it around, and you're checking for rubbing of the emergency brake, and you're also checking that the sensor's not rubbing the tone ring. So we're good to go. So let's go ahead and make sure they're good and snug. Make sure all the bolts are good and tight. Everything, there's nothing making contact. Now we're ready to replug our sensor back in. always zip tie the wire to the first bracket that you put on. But when I zip tie it, I don't pull it tight, because if you pull it tight, the wires are going to rub. So I always give a little bit of gap and then tighten it. All right. If you don't zip tie that wire, chances of it getting into something are probably pretty slim, but the time it does get into something, then you're not going to have any, you're not going to have any speedometer reading, and it's going to blow fuses and stuff. So that's why we zip tied in there. So now we're ready to go ahead and reinstall the rotor and the axle. If you look at the rotor, it has a nut side, then it has a bolt side, a bolt head side. The nut side comes out. And then I always put my keyway groove right here. I always put it up, but just go ahead and slide that in like that. So if you did not move your rotor back and forth and open up that caliper, you're probably going to have to open it back up to get that rotor to slide back in there. So once that's in there, now we are ready to put our axle back in with our bushing. Make sure the big keyway is in there. Your bushing, it slides over. Make sure it's good and free. That's going to help you later on in this process. So make sure that one's there. Take your other keyway, just stick it in the top, and that's what slides through the rotor like that. So this axle only goes in one way. If you look here, it's your snap ring groove that goes out. So the other side, it's nice and tapered, that goes into the 2-speed. Do your best to get it lined up before you slide it in, and try not to hit that seal. Probably won't damage it, but the less times we make contact with the rubber part of that seal, the better. So go ahead and put it in there like that and kind of slide it all in there together. We're good for now. We actually set our rotor position after we put our final drive on. So now we're ready to reinstall the final drive. At this point in the process, we're ready to put our final drive back onto the tractor. A couple things to point out. Number one, make sure your vented plug is on the top of your final drive. And the axle slides in through this gear. You're lining up splines, so it's probably not going to just slide right on. You're going to have to move it and lift it and turn the spindle out here to be able to get everything lined up. And then we'll just kind of work through it. Sometimes they go on really easy, really well. Sometimes you kind of got to fight them to get them on. So just got to have a little patience when we're doing it, and we'll work through it. Okay, are you ready? All right, so I want to get it kind of lined up. One way that I've done it before is you can slide a 5/8 rod through there and into the top hole. That kind of pulls some of the weight off, but you got to just kind of do it whichever way makes the most sense to you and the way that feels the easiest for you. So let's go ahead and we'll try to slide it on without the dowel, and then if we need the dowel, we'll just insert the dowel. So when you're doing it, make sure that you get it at the right height, and again, you don't want to let that axle crash into that seal on the inside, because it could damage it, and then that's going to cause a leak. You're going to have to pull it back off. So go ahead, and you can feel the gear and the axle mesh together. And once you get it close, you can take a bolt and just put it in through one of the holes. It kind of takes some of the weight off of it, helps line it up as you're sliding it in. And So get those bolts started in there. Then I take the nut and I just start the nut. I make sure there's a nut on the back side of the bolt before I get rid of my chain hoist. Because if you don't, the chances of it sliding off are very slim. But if it does, it's gonna crash down on your feet. And that's why I always put a nut on the back side. Everything's still loose, it just can't slide off. So this one here, you may have to back the bolt up a little bit to be able to get the nut on. So now that we have all the nuts started, let's go ahead and let's get rid of our chain hoist. Kind of get it off here to the side. All right, so now what we are looking to do is we have it all lined up. We can't just bolt it right on because we want that axle to be able to float in there. This axle is short enough that it's got to be pretty much perfectly lined up to get that axle to float. And what happens is if that axle is not floating in there, it could be wearing on one side or the other on that seal on the 2-speed. So that is the reason why we want to get that axle to float. So how I do it is I just go ahead and I tighten up the bolt and the nut with a wrench and get it snug and kind of get it in the right spot so that axle moves in and out. So let's just go ahead and snug them up by hand. You still want it to be able to move up and down, but you want to get it as close to tight without tightening it. Here's the front one up here. So remember, there's only 3 bolts that we're tightening. Okay, now let's go down here, and there's a front, a middle, and a back. Okay, once you get your final drive bolted up on, it's secure. This is what you're trying to get to. So that axle in there is floating back and forth. If this final drive isn't aligned correctly, that axle is going to be tight, and that's what we do not want. Usually if you spin it, it's going to spin really, really free, and that's good. And you're going to be able to find the spot where the axle slides in and out, and that's what you want. We have had a little bit better success when you get the 3 bolts in. If you take that final drive and you pick up on it, maybe use your chain hoist, maybe use a floor jack. If you pick up on it just ever so slightly, that will help you achieve that floating axle as well. So now that we got everything in the right spot, we have it so the axle is floating, let's go ahead and tighten it up with our 1/2-inch impact and our wrench. Let's go ahead and let's put our snap ring back on. So you can kind of hear it clip in, and then if you put real light tension on it, that snap ring slides back and forth in that groove. And I usually take a flashlight and look and make sure it's completely in the groove. And then what I like to do is check and make sure it's still floating. So I'm in here, I'm on the brake rotor bushing, and I'm pulling out, and I'm just pushing in the center of the axle. And that's what you want to achieve to make that seal last the longest. So now that we got our snap ring in, let's go ahead and let's put our cover on out here. And that is going to need to be siliconed. We just use a black RTV silicone. And the best is probably to put it right here on the final drive. You just need a real small bead clear around. And then you're going to get your 3 flanged 5/16 bolts. Make sure you put Loctite on them, because all bolts that have a blue mark on them have blue Loctite on them installed from the factory. You'll see one that has a red mark on it and that has red Loctite installed from the factory. All right, got Loctite and silicone on that, and these are 1/2-inch heads. All right, that is installed. All right, now that you got the final drive installed, now we are ready to set our brake rotor. You might ask, why do you have to set the brake rotor? Why can't you just lock the bushing down? It's because this brake rotor is floating in here in between the pads, and you want to keep it floating in between the pads. If you go ahead and you just put that bushing in and you pull that brake rotor clear against the outside pad, the caliper's never going to be able to release enough to let that rotor spin freely in there. It's going to cause heat, excessive heat. Your pads are going to wear out, your rotor's going to wear out. It's not going to stop correctly. So that's why we need to center that rotor in between those pads. And there is definitely a fine line in between getting it centered and it rubbing. So this may take a couple times as well. It's still a challenging process sometimes as we build them on the line. But it's all done by hand, and there's really no perfect way to do it. So basically what I do is I open that caliper completely up, and I did that with the rotor. When I rock it back, I push the pads clear back. I want to make it so that front pad is loose. And that's going to be, because when this bushing goes into that rotor, it's actually going to want to pull that rotor this way. So that's why I want my gap towards me. So the first thing I do is I go ahead and I seat that bushing into the rotor. The way I do it is I just take a rubber mallet, stick it on there, and I just crack it just like that. And basically it already presets that into there, that way you don't have to quite tighten up the bolts as far, and there's not as much movement. It allows us to be able to get it tighter before the rotor moving. So that's what I do. And you don't use a piece of steel. Either use a piece of wood with a hammer or like a rubber mallet with a hammer, because you could damage this, mess it up so you can't get the bolts through. Now you're going to take the 3 little black bolts that had blue lines on them, and we're going to put Loctite back on them and install them into the bushing. You're going to want to push them through the first part of the bushing and thread them into the rotor. And you can rotate this if you need to. All right, so then what I try to do is I take these 2 screwdrivers and I put them in between the rotor and the caliper. And the reason I do that is so that it tightens up that bushing just a little bit more before it starts pulling the rotor into that pad, to hopefully get it centered and it worked the first time. So I always take them and I just give them a little tap. And then I reach down there and I make sure that pad is still loose. Because you can get messed up if that screwdriver is hitting that pad. You're like, oh, it's already tight, we're done. And then you pull the screwdriver out and you're loose and it's not in the right spot. So get your screwdrivers in there, make sure your pad's still loose. And then you will just take a normal 1/2-inch wrench and just start tightening them up. You want to do them, snug them, and then work your way around the bushing and do each one separately and the same amount as you go. So all right, now they're all snugged up, so now we're just going to basically work our way around the circle to tighten that bushing up evenly. You will find that one is tight and then you'll tighten another one and it loosens it up. Basically, you're just working that bushing into that rotor and making it so it doesn't move on the axle anymore. You don't need to crank these down super tight. I have found if you crank them down too tight, then you end up pulling it against and it's not where it's supposed to be. So go ahead and move your screwdrivers out of there. And what you want to hear, so as I turn it, it gets tight right there. And then it gets loose right there. That means that rotor is not quite straight on the axle. So how I fix that is I spin it to where it gets tight, and then I look which bolts are down when it's getting tight. So I see that this bolt definitely, and maybe a little bit on this one, I will bring those up and I will tighten those bolts a little bit more. And that pulls that rotor even more this way. So it still could use a little bit more. And let's determine which bolt we want to tighten up now. So if you listen, you'll be able to hear the rotor drag on the pad. Let's tighten this one here just a little bit more. That's basically what you want. You want that rotor to spin through that caliper free and not drag on any of those pads, the inside or the outside pad. And if you do it and you pull that rotor too far this way, you just have to start over. You got to remove those 3 bolts, thread them into the holes, and break that bushing in the rotor apart, and then just go through the process again. Most of the time, that's going to work. Sometimes it doesn't. So, like I said, there's times on the line that it takes me a couple times to get it perfectly aligned. After you got that good and tight, I usually make a mark on my axle where it floats the best, and I make it so that mark is up, and then I spin my rotor around, and then I want to check and make sure everything's floating and where it's supposed to be. So now we're ready to, we have our seal replaced, we got all the brackets and everything put back in, we put our final drive on, we've set our rotor, and now we're ready to put our fender on and put it all back together and put our wheel on. We're ready to go back out and work. So the next step in the process, let's go ahead and let's put our fender back on and put a rotor shield back on, and then you're ready to put your wheel on. So, all right, let's go over here and grab our fender. You may need a friend to help you do this, but you notice there is a little ledge on here. We do set the fenders on there if you don't have somebody to help you. All right, so once you get the first one in, at least get a nut on it, that way it can't fall off. But go ahead and start your other ones. And most of the time, you take these bolts out, the nuts are usually still up in the light box. So if you're looking for them, that's probably where they're at. So how I get all the bolts started, and then I just kind of pick up and push forward. And then pick up on the back. All right, after you've got those put back on, go ahead and put our rotor shield back on. You'll need 4 of the bolts. Pre-start all these bolts by hand. You're going into that, it's like a U-nut or a speed nut. And if you just run them in with the impact, you tend to ruin the speed nut. So go ahead and start them by hand, and then we'll after you got your rotor cover back on, let's go ahead and put the bolts that come through. 2 of them come through here for the battery cover. 1 will come through here for like the shifter cover. You should be able to get these started without loosening these, but if you can't get them started, just loosen the front 2 here. These are going to need to be done with a ratchet wrench, or if you have an impact with a swivel on it, you can do them that way. But if you have to loosen these 2 and this battery cover kind of hangs down, make sure that it's not rubbing back there on the negative battery cable. In the video that I do of replacing the battery, I emphasize that as well. So if you want some more explanation on that, go back and refer to that video. All right, then we'll put our 3rd one in here, the shifter cover. You guys probably noticed that this tractor is missing some shields and pieces. It's not done yet, but it was the closest and the best one to be able to use for the video, so that's what we did. So, all right, now that you got that tight, after you get all your shield bolts on, now you're ready to refill the 2-speed with hydraulic oil. Refer back to this sticker or refer back to your owner's manual on what kind to use and how much to use, but this is where you're going to go ahead and refill your 2-speed. Once you get that refilled, now we're ready to put the wheel back on. If you have any questions with that, refer back to that video. But this has been everything you need to do to replace a seal on the 2-speed. Everything from removing the final drive, the inner fenders, the rotor cover, how to get the axle out, how to realign the rotor, reset the rotor, clear down to removing and replacing the seal. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this video is helpful. If there's anything else you guys need, please reach out. So thank you.